Our speaker for this morning is the head of the Energy, Materials, and Infrastructure Industry Communities at the World Economic Forum, where he oversees the involvement of industry partners in the forum's programs and activities, with direct responsibility for the materials industries. Please welcome me in joining me, Dr. Fernando Gómez, Head of Industry Communities of Energy, Materials, and Infrastructure of the World Economic Forum, who will address the focus on the industry through uncertainty, a question of choice. There will also be a Q&A after the session, so I would encourage you all to use the Slido tool to send your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asil. It's always daunting to get started after those incredible videos that tell half of the story that one wants to tell. But it's a real pleasure. It's an honor to be back on this stage in the annual forum of GPCA. Feels like coming back home. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the hospitality, as usual, to come to the region and the vision and the interest of the GPCA leadership in allowing us to share some ideas based on the work that we do at the World Economic Forum with our communities, with our groups, and with our partners. I have to start, maybe for those of you who do not know the World Economic Forum, we are the international organization for public-private collaboration. Actually, public-private is maybe the beginning of the thought of this organization, but the reality is that we have learned that only through a true multi-stakeholder approach, some of the greatest challenges and probably some of the best ideas for collaboration can emerge. And that's the reason why we've been working with many of you in a couple of the activities and the programs that I will mention today. I'll particularly refer to the work that we do with some of our communities, partly the chemical industry, the consumer industries at the World Economic Forum, but also our colleagues in the new economy and society, the strategic intelligence, and the global risks team. So in a true collaborative spirit, we've been able to draw some, hopefully, interesting ways to get started a conversation, a dialogue with many of you. The way that I propose we do this is maybe just go very quickly what it means to be performing through uncertainty. We have a very recent example of performance through uncertainty. And I would like to maybe take a couple of minutes, go back in time, go back not too far back, but just maybe a year or two, and see what kind of lessons we were drawing from performing through uncertainty. And then here we are today in yet another realm, slightly different, but characterized by this uncertainty again. But I would love to share with you what we see as different now. And then the focus of this, which is, can this be an issue of choice, as opposed to simply sitting back and looking at a very significant disruption in the geopolitical and in the geoeconomic landscape? Is there an opportunity for choosing to act? That's probably the central question. And then we'll probably take a very quick look at food systems, since this is the focus of the sessions today at GPCA. Food systems actually give us great examples and probably many opportunities as well to choose to act and to choose to act with others. But let's take a little look at 2021. 6% was the GDP growth in 2021. Against, this is IMF figures. This was against many of expectations. How could we have grown globally at 6%? This was actually predicted in the IMF mid-year, and sure enough, we ended up around this time. There were a couple of interventions that were critical to ensure that the world didn't fall into a very deep hole as we were trying to navigate COVID. I'd like to highlight two. One is the United States recovery programs that would actually bring a boost and through ripple effects actually through the entire global economy. But the other was a rollout of vaccination programs that allowed people to get back. Interesting to see how, in the end, policy interventions that are well informed by other stakeholders have implications on us all, on our households, on our neighborhoods, on our municipal economies, and these were some examples. Now, that recovery, there were some concerns about how solid that recovery was going to be for various reasons. One is there's a gap between the financial figures and the real economy, and especially when we get really into the details of wages, employment. Many of the figures that we were seeing actually allowed us to understand that there were still some, first of all, the crisis that we were going through, that global shock, was not impacting all jobs equally. And there were some jobs that we were able to do from the comfort of our screens in our homes. There were many jobs that did not offer that opportunity. And that was the beginning of a bit of a crack through our labor systems because of COVID. This was the beginning of also some social fragmentation, and there were real concerns about societal upheaval, and similar to what we had seen in the past because of this, simply because of how a pandemic was impacting us all differently. This brings us to this moment in which we look at 2021. 2022 we estimate to end in the region of 3.2%. This is again IMF data. And 2023, sorry, I think I said 2022. 2023, probably a bit of a contraction there. So what is it that allowed us to, in a way, sustain growth? There was a lot of momentum in global growth. There were some policies that were successful, as I mentioned. But at some point, it creates the uncertainty, and maybe what we see is a bit of a contraction. Of course, this is, it's a very different world right now. When we break that up, it's quite interesting to see actually that those projections, again by IMF, I chose the regional view, and quite interesting to see that, of course, many regions are going to be impacted much more severely by the combination of shocks that we have. To be standing in Riyadh, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and to look at the Middle East and Central Asia as a whole, and see a good expectation, that's the only bar that goes up, actually, between 2021 and 2022. And this region is benefiting, of course, because of exports of oil and gas and commodities that the world still needs. But the interesting part of this is we are now in a way, accumulated crisis situation. This is no news. I think there are three factors. You'll see four balls there, but there are three factors that have been identified as being critical to the change in the landscape. And I'll get to what that means for the chemical industry. One is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a war that has come back. Of course, every time that we talk about the economic implications of a war, it is important to remember that the greatest impact is, of course, at the humanitarian level, the loss of lives, the loss of livelihoods, and the human suffering. That's why this is obviously top. But as we look at performance and landscape for financial performance, for economic performance, naturally, the multiple implications of conflict, displacement, the changes in commodity markets that you will discuss today in much more depth are quite evident. The second is what we are experiencing in many parts of the world, a real crisis in cost of living. Arguable because of high cost of energy in some economies and how this translates into our day-to-day expenditures, the ability for households to sustain decent levels is challenged. And the last one is what we have maybe looked at as a whole China effect. There are a couple of things in there. One is maybe a subdued growth, a deceleration in some of the critical consumption markets, particularly construction. But the reality is that there are many other questions about the role of China in the geopolitical arena, and China having to lock down, open, lock down, significant impact on global value chains. I've added a fourth there, which really has to do a lot with the confidence factor, and we'll go back to this concept when we look at choice in our hands. To what extent all this combined just simply pushes the confidence of businesses, pushes the confidence of society in general, and frankly of policymakers. So these may be some of the key reasons behind this challenge growth. This was the picture then, the last time that we looked at a significant disruption on the landscape for the industry. Now the picture has been complemented by conflict, and they are not in series. They're actually piling onto each other. We asked the community of chief economists of the World Economic Forum for their sentiment about a number of economic implications, and I've chosen to highlight a couple here. One, I think I mentioned quite briefly, the cost of living is probably expected to tighten conditions for many around the world over the next year. These are the percent of respondents among the group of chief economists who think that poverty will increase in high income and in low income, and to what level. And it is by now in their minds a consensus that we are going to see a return to poverty to many that have emerged poverty recently and were in very vulnerable bands of their livelihoods. And the second is real wages, which really compromises our ability again to sustain healthy consumption and has a direct impact on our ability to save as households. For the industry, this is, as you know, a quite important indicator. The fact that we take a lot of pride from the chemical industry perspective as people in the world emerge from poverty, to see poverty decreasing is definitely a concerning figure. A lot of the gains that we've been able to benefit from an economics perspective, but also from a social and humanitarian perspective, come from our ability to be part of that emergence from poverty in the world. There are a couple of other elements that I've put on the side. One is to what extent can energy and food subsidies end up compensating for consumer prices and our ability to consume at the household level. It is always a challenge to identify what the right threshold is for these subsidies and participation through policy or through direct cash injections, and at some point they need to be well allocated. From an industry perspective, we will see to what extent there will be flexibility across these pockets. And the last one is there's actually a sentiment that we might be in an increased likelihood of civil unrest, especially in some of the developing economies. Now that paints a very gloomy picture, but the reality is that the sentiment as we look into the next year gives us again an opportunity to rethink our role. Should we wait to see if some of these things are going to happen, or is there an opportunity to take a more of a leading role in some of these transformations? I have two more pieces of data from our conversation with chief economists. One is in food security, and I think this is directly related to the topic of today. We wanted to find out in what regions of the world we were going to go from a situation of reasonably secure to highly insecure, secure, or highly secure. And you can see in the maybe golden or brown circles on the screen that sub-Saharan Africa and to some extent the northern part of Africa and the Middle East are considered to be at high risk of going back to higher level of food insecurity or high insecurity. And the last one is the energy transition. Last time I was here on this stage, we were talking about the role of the chemical industry in the overall energy transition. As we know, this is a multidimensional process, but it takes a long time. It takes a long time to go through this pathway. And to what extent this current combination of crisis compromises that, the sentiment is that there's a chance that it will slow down the energy transition in the great majority of the world, except for Europe. And I know that we've gone into lots of details of why Europe is having to accelerate and maybe speed up a number of especially in the sustainability dimension of the energy transition, actions to sustain it. Back to the industry. So, of course, we look at financial performance and economic performance for the sector, but this has been largely debated here in this forum, so I probably skip a number of those. But there's a number of trade-offs in terms of our understanding of the role that the industry can take that I would love to highlight. In some ways, what is happening today, and we hear this from a number of you, It sounds familiar. We've been there before. We've been through crises. Crises are good opportunities, are good challenges. We will emerge as a sector. So it does feel like the cyclicality, let's say the normal conditions of going up and down, supply increases, margins go down. This feels very familiar. But there are other elements that feel less familiar. And those are the ones that I would love to maybe spend a bit of time for the industry. One is, to what extent this sector is demonstrating with real actions that it is a credible partner in very distributed ecosystems, which is where we address the economic concerns and the direct concerns for people to bring food to their tables. Can we say that we, through our actions, through our products, our services, our technologies, are a credible partner in those ecosystems? This is the moment for the industry leadership to say, there is an opportunity in every crisis, and the way to tackle that is to be a credible partner in these systems. That's one. The second is, always we've challenged our innovation teams with trying to come up with different business models. This is the moment for a lot of sensitivity at the societal and economic level to explore alternative business models to serve with the performance that is needed. Now, we think performance largely through products. We see examples. I think the circular economy has allowed us to be a bit more creative and not necessarily to sell carpet, but to rent carpet one day. We hear some of these interesting initiatives in terms of utilizing those mega trends to challenge ourselves in the creation of new business models. Can this be it? And to use this as a trigger and to put people first can be a pocket of opportunity for the sector that is different than the general cycles that come from supply, demand, and tightening margins that you know very well. The third one is more attention to what we call environmental conditions, everything that is happening outside of the fence of our companies. Yes, you have followed every day geopolitical stability, geoeconomic trends, but there are a couple that are coming up quite strongly, and I'll get to one of them in particular, which is the role of technology and how geoeconomics and technology are becoming one. One way to think about this is in cybersecurity. Those can be very characteristic of a crisis moments in which our attention might be in sustaining performance, looking at our P&Ls and our balance sheets, when in reality the performance and the longer-term sustainability of a business actor may be much more related to conditions that are outside. And the last one is, again, this confidence factor. It was very interesting to hear many of the speakers in this same forum acknowledging, coming out very forward and saying, it's actually very challenging today, but we're going to do it. If it's true that the industry is going into 2023, which is going to be not exactly the best year for the sector, but with a good level of confidence, is the moment to utilize that positively. Our sector, we did some work as in the onset of COVID, trying to figure out the roles that the sector played towards a global shock. So we have global shocks, we have lots of them. Sounds like they're more and more frequent. Now here we are, basically 1 year after the last one, roughly. This global shock of a geopolitical destabilization, a war, a year after COVID. We look at this and say, well, we take a lot of pride in how we respond. So that was the first R. Lots of pride in this room. We provided the masks. We made more ethanol and allow all of us to disinfect our hands. There was a lot of examples. PPE, saving lives by the day, pieces of respirators, using advanced armor. So there was a lot of pride here in the way in which we respond. The second part was a bit more challenging. Can we be an active part of the recovery that comes after COVID? There were some good interest in deploying our products in for example, the infrastructure programs that existed in large economies. Building materials, construction chemicals, part of the recovery, getting people back into jobs, all these economic recovery elements that you've been able to be part of it. The toughest one was the last one, because in a moment of crisis, it's very difficult to think of long-term resilience. But this is exactly our invitation to all of you to, as you respond with PPE and masks and in any way that you're responding today, to not lose sight of what needs to be done to build societal resilience. In addition to your own resilience, your supply chains, you are actually, yesterday's conversation about supply chain illustrated that because of some of these trends, because of perhaps a deglobalization sentiment, because of having to localize production again and ensure that there's greater stability on supply chains, there's a very good interest in building your resilience as a sector. Now our invitation has been, but society seems to be much more vulnerable. We just saw that many are going back into poverty. We just saw that people are struggling to pay their energy bills in some developed economies. Do we have a role in building greater societal resilience? We did this work in very good collaboration with our friends at Accenture, who are here as well, and identified 6 ideas on how to rethink the role of the sector in creating greater societal resilience. I won't have time to go through the details of all of them, but very quickly, definitely work on the credibility, show that you are part of building resilience for society. Be vocal, show that products, solutions that are offered by this sector are part of a bigger package that allow people to feel safer looking into the future. That's one. Second, much more deliberate about building flexibility in your portfolios. Perhaps it is time to go to that mothball asset and figure out how you can put it to work for greater societal good. The third one is be much more connected in your own ecosystems. It's only through anticipating that into your ecosystems that you'll be able to understand what goes beyond the production of the polymers you make every day or ethylene oxide. The last one is, the next one is a bit more internal, and it's a question for all of you, leaders of organizations. Have you been able to instill a resilience culture within your organization? During my time in a chemical company, we had incredible pride because of our culture of response. The best, managing metal alkyls the way that only that company could do it. But are we doing the same thing to build a resilience culture, to ensure that our families, our neighborhoods can be just as resilient after a global shock? The fifth one is you know a lot. You know a lot. Your know-how, your assets, your infrastructure, they have served you incredibly, and some of your partners. To what extent can that mechanism be extended to a larger group? And the last one is to be very deliberate about inclusivity. We just saw that there were parts of society that experienced these global shocks way harder than many of us. So can our business models, can some of the products that you make every day be designed with inclusivity or with inclusion in mind? These were some of the thoughts that came out from this work. And again, they sound familiar because they are familiar. Here we are again in one of those global shocks. Just, there's no prediction, but there is another one coming. I don't know if it's going to be in a year or two, but there's going to be another one coming. And in our global risks team that comes up every year with a map of risks, the next one will be up in January. We hear a lot of interest in frankly, understanding technology and looking at how technology is being weaponized today, and at some point is going to be completely out of our hands and probably surprise a global shock of that category. Of interest was also the thought that the long path of the energy transition can be at stake. We talked about, in some cases, slowing down some of the decisions that need to be made, particularly investment decisions, are very tough decisions to be made in bad times. But I think we could survey today this room and ask what is needed today to ensure that the energy transition gets on track, and the answer will probably say a lot of investment. A lot of investment today. So protecting the energy transition from global shocks becomes a job, because if we wait until there's a year when there is no shock and there is no crisis to rethink the way in which we're going to invest in it, we probably won't find it. So this comes back to this question of the choice. What are the things that we could be choosing to do? What kind of more active roles could we be choosing to play towards them? Here's some ideas. One is to be much more vocal and much more explicit about the trade-offs that we are going to have to make to satisfy maintaining livelihoods, Responding to growth, I think we also heard for the last couple of days that responding to growth is a job, and we will do it for the next 30 years or for however long there is economic growth, population growth, the demand for your products. There's enough interest in doing it, but I think we need to be as a sector a bit more vocal about the trade-offs. What is it going to take for us not to do, or where will be the compromises on the maybe even financial performance that we're going to have to look at very critically and say, to be able to do that, this is the trade-off. So to be much more vocal about them builds lots of credibility, lots of social credibility and credibility with your partners. The second is emphasizing this idea of designing for resilience building. Not only building that resilience culture, but asking yourselves to what extent the products that you are developing today, go back to your R&D labs, look at your portfolios, and see what is coming in the next 5, 10 years. How much of that actually embeds this idea that societies need to be strengthened by what we do from a sector perspective. The next one is to, we benefit from having a global industry, I think from having a healthy trade system. Global disintegration is happening. There's a lot of localization, there's a lot of nationalism, there's a lot of these barriers that are being put again. But for this sector to be sustainable and to continue to make the contributions that it has made, it requires a level of integration. Yes, there will be some production that will be localized, but the global structures have served us very well to ensure that the markets and that we design economic structures for chemical manufacture that work. The next one is on human capital. And it shouldn't be the fourth. Quite frankly, I should have put this at the very beginning, because the fair question that we have asked a number of our communities is, we talk about big changes. The energy transition is a huge change in front of us. Building resilience is a huge change in front of us. To what extent are we incorporating those elements in the development of human capital, what really makes your companies, which is your people? And the last one is to not let this opportunity go. Shaping the energy transition, shaping the moment in which everybody wants to not only build more sustainable, that's one of the dimensions of the energy systems, of the energy transition, but energy systems that are also inclusive and reliable and accessible, and those who continue to deliver performance. This is the moment for this sector to take that leading role. If you can, do not wait to be part of the solution. Pick up the phone, lead the solution. We'll take a lot of pride in saying we're part of the solution. What if we did it the other way? Choose to drive that transformation ourselves. I want to spend 2 minutes on the food security. This is one of our transformation maps in our strategic intelligence work. Every time that we say what are the issues that are defining now the landscape of food security, this is where they end up, in a representation of highly interconnected issues. I'm going to go very quickly through them because today is a real good example of what is happening with our food security. And I'm going to start on the right top side. One is, it's not only that a bad economic moment can generate a food crisis. It's really interesting to think of the opposite direction. When food crises come and when the food systems are more vulnerable, actually has horrible implications on the midterm economic structures. People are malnourished. There is a sense of, again, insecurity at home. And the ripple effect on the economic performance of our structures starts by not having enough nutritious food at the table. The second is climate change. I think this is quite obvious. There are lots of vulnerabilities in the food systems because of what is happening on the climate side. And that's where, again, designing for resilience, what you do in agrochem can go a long way. The last is the foundation. And to what extent are we investing in the foundational elements, the knowledge that is necessary to maintain food systems healthy? I don't want to know what happened there. The other elements are related to innovation, to what extent we can actually utilize the moment. There's a lot of technology that needs to go in there to build that resilience into the systems. That's the last one there. The cost is, we've talked about it, the vulnerability of on the cost side and the economics of our food system is increasing. And the bottom one, we've seen it, and it's no longer theory. Conflict withdraws commodities from markets, conflict breaks trade routes, and compromises our ability to maintain a global food system healthy. What started then as a health crisis and then now followed by a geopolitical crisis, and we've talked a lot of the economic crisis of it, now there's a fourth component of it, which is a food crisis globally. And they seem to be feeding each other. The fact that there's a food crisis, you do not want to see a different type of health crisis unfolding because of malnutrition. So these are symbiotic, they are well connected, and it's a moment for all of us to look at them as pretty much as a whole, and to bring those ideas of how to respond, how to recover this, and how to bring resilience to that system as a whole. Choices then, and I think I'm going to close with this. It's a moment to address this systemically. It's not an issue of inputs manufacturers or the food companies or the brands or the food and beverage companies. This is actually as systemic as it gets. The farmer, the environment minister, the innovation think tank, the universities. Only until we think of food systems holistically will we be able to bring that resilience that is necessary there. Food systems are the real example of thinking global and local at the same time. There's a word that I learned in Switzerland, is the word glocal. I didn't know it. But food systems are exactly that. And as much as we would like to develop a picture that is globalized and a single one, the reality is that lots of things happen on the ground. The third out of fourth is thinking of value of food, not so much availability of food, but food means different things in different environments. Food means different things in our cultures. And this is the moment to maybe shift a little bit of thinking of not only economic and financial value for us as part of the business elements of this ecosystem, but the value of food for everybody. And the last one, it is the moment to dare to innovate, because if this is not a good opportunity to look down the road at what is going to be needed tomorrow, we get very excited to see some of the innovations on the biology side. We get quite excited to see that we may be able to make green ammonia affordably. There's so many opportunities that can actually be positioned in strengthening the food systems of tomorrow. With that, I want to thank you and welcome your questions in the conversation. Thank you so much.
Fernando, we really value your support and thank you for being with us at the GPCA Forum once again. You mentioned you've been here 4 times, and that's absolutely right. And over the years, you have spoken about topics such as energy transition, Industrial Revolution 4.0, big risks that the world is facing. How are those topics that you spoke about last time linked to the topics of today?
That's a good question. I think the way to think about it is there are many of these bigger transformations that are happening, and they're happening concurrently. It's easy to fall into the idea that on some frequency we talk about the 4th Industrial Revolution, and a different frequency we talk about global risks. And of course, lately we've been talking a lot about the energy transition. The reality is that they are quite connected. For example, one of the technologies that we look at in the 4th Industrial Revolution is biological technologies. We've seen just in the last 5 years how much we've been able to advance in technologies for gene editing, biology, etc., so synthetic biology. And these can be part of those R's that we've mentioned. Now, they do need good governance structures, they do need the right frameworks, but they're actually quite related. I think technology has a role to play in there. We talked about the energy transition. We look at the chemical sector, and still ammonia manufacturing is one of those steps that we need to address if we want to reduce the emissions or go to a net zero or to a zero or any stage in dramatically reducing the emissions of the sector. But there's still need for fertilization. I know that we're going to go into detail for this, and these new technologies are still not at the economic parity point, and somebody needs to pick up the difference. Is it the farmer?
Yeah.
Is it that part of society that perhaps is not only much more impoverished but has less of discussion? So these are quite related issues, and hopefully maybe these contributions are a way to maintain those linkages and those connections among issues that are quite important, and that give the opportunity for the chemical industry to find a spot that is just as central and new opportunities for leading them. Right?
Okay, maybe I'll take one of the questions that have come up from the audience here. There are some indications that inflation may have peaked in some markets. Do you expect that pressure to recede over the next year?
I don't have the figures. I don't have the figure to say if next year is the year in which inflation would recede. We are all, in a way, in a holding pattern, waiting to see to what extent the different components of inflation. We spent some time trying to figure out whether this was a supply-driven inflation because of the withdrawal of some commodities into the market, and that was creating prices to go up, or more of a demand-driven inflation. Sounds like it's a combination of both. So I will not be able to predict whether next year is the year when the pressure recedes. What we do want to understand is that, for the most part, the consensus is that growth and maybe an economy going into either a recession or a technical recession is going to be in front of us, and inflationary pressures are highlighted as one of the reasons why. So there seems to be, especially in these communities with whom we work, the expectation that inflation will hold into next year. But will that be the end? I'm unfortunately unable to say.
On the topic of inflation, we have seen a decent inflation taking place in the agricultural sector, the price of food, but also the price of the fertilizers fluctuating quite a bit over the last year and a half. And the World Economic Forum has made a number of activities on this front. In what way have the activities of the forum helped to improve food security? Can you shed some light on that for us, please?
Yeah, so I've been at the forum for 12 years. One of my early involvement was in a remarkable initiative at the time called a New Vision for Agriculture, in which we were able to involve stakeholders truly across the entire spectrum. The private sector, we would have from the seed companies and some of the inputs all the way to really brands and retailers, and that was only business. And we looked at different commodities and in different geographies, and to what extent bringing people together and addressing issues together, which is what the forum takes a lot of pride in doing, we could succeed. There were examples of this. This became Grow Asia. This became our New Vision for Agriculture in Mexico. So Vietnam. So there were a number of maybe following that recipe, and that was in the last decade. Much more recently, we've been working in the space of innovation. To what extent innovation, especially digital innovation quite recently, can increase the output, the yields, and improve the livelihood of farmers, which ultimately are at the heart of our system. Yeah. So I think there have been opportunities to look at coming together to identify issues, much more recently innovation. Our work today on reforestation and protecting forests in some point actually is well related with our interest in greater agricultural output. So there are little pockets, and frankly for the chemical industry much more recently, our ability to work in drafting the sector transition strategies for ammonia, or the initiative in which some of the partners here are involved, low carbon emitting technologies, in which there's actually a good view of a potential project in that space. There are different pieces of the puzzle, I guess, in the space of food security and agriculture, but it's a real active part of the forum. We have a memorandum of understanding with the United Nations, work closely with FAO, and these other organizations that are part of a broader ecosystem.
Excellent. And on the topic of food security, and you shared a bit about the connection with energy security as well. And there's a question from the audience here. The climate change policies and regulations today are contributing to food shortages. What are your reflections? I find that quite an interesting question.
It's a great question. Role.
Yeah.
It's a trade-off. It's a very difficult balancing act. So
yeah.
This is why it's so difficult. If you just look at policies, forget the business for a second, or forget the farmer for a second, or society, we come from a past in which policies happen in different buildings of our government structures.
Yeah.
Agricultural policy is drafted in building A, energy policy in building B, and the industrial policy in building C, and transportation in building D. Just that creates a bit of a challenge of integration. I think more particularly when we look at responses for climate change that can be compromising, it's possible that that's one of those trade-offs we're going to have to balance. We do not want to see a situation in which responding to one creates a disaster on the other. In an effort to maintain our supply of agricultural inputs, or any type of input that we have, we take our eyes off the commitments that we need to make to address sustainability issues. Or the opposite, that whether by policy or by voluntary action, responding strongly to the need to reduce emissions, we end up withdrawing some of the inputs that are necessary to grow crops globally. So it's a very difficult balancing act. I think the reflection is, this is why this type of connected, informed leadership is necessary more than any time in the past, because these issues are systemic, highly interconnected, and it is no longer a single actor, a single sector, a single geography that can provide the responses that are needed to sustain these two big trends.
Excellent. Fernando,
Those are hard questions.
Please ask some more hard questions, but we are also running out of time. The World Economic Forum releases some very interesting analysis, reports, publications, and you collect a lot of data. And one of the big challenges we face today is that we have so much data, but how do we still predict when is the next health crisis coming? When does the next food crisis start? How can we better prepare ourselves, incubate ourselves from these risks that are coming up? With all of this data available today, how can we really make that next step today to understand where is the next big risk coming from?
Well, lots packed in that question. So we don't know. Nobody knows when the next, or what kind of is going to be the next global shock. So I think that's a reality. Now we have deployed lots of, not the forum, we as all of us, deployed lots of beautiful solutions, incredible innovations in terms of data. I think our ability to, for example, some of the environmental related shocks, our ability to understand, let's say, big weather events has increased significantly. It doesn't make us solid in terms of prediction of impact when it's, but we've learned a lot. Some are much more the manifestation of a trend that has been accumulated. So if we do end up with a global shock, such as a, let's say, global water shortage, this keeps coming up in our global risks report as one of those looming horrible risks for humanity, in which, and it can actually be the trigger for many more, for water-based conflict, for water-based inability to produce. When, how big, impossible to know, but can we prepare? Can we see this map of global risks and say, of these, first of all, I want to have a part of, as a sector or as a company or as a policymaker, to say we actually need to play a critical role there. I think that's where the opportunity is. Figure out how you would respond, figure out how you would be part of a recovery, and much more attractively, how you can be working today on building resilience so that when it happens, you're in a good place to absorb it.
Thank you. And my last question is focused on the topic that will come up in the next session, which is focused on food security and the role of the agri-nutrients industry, which plays an important role today in ensuring food security for millions of people around the world. What is your what do you expect for this sector in the coming years? What do they need to do? What do they need to change? And what should be they prepared for?
Look, I think if we just focus on innovation as a telltale over the interest and the opportunity can be, I think I can just refer to that. We have lots of things to do on a seminal process of our industry, which is making ammonia. We have lots of work to do there. Probably half of this room is very busy today in addressing exactly that. So I probably wouldn't spend time on that. I'm quite keen maybe to share with you what we're seeing on the frontier edge. Happy to be working with a number of partners on, as I mentioned, some of these biological solutions. Mm-hmm. There's real interest in working on soil, plant, root uptake of nutrients, ensure that our food systems have a different way that is not necessarily those that have put us at risk in some cases of over-fertilization. I'm quite excited to see that. I think when we think of innovation, we also tend to think of technological innovation only. There's a lot on the social entrepreneurship that we've also had the opportunity to be part of from an organization perspective. To what extent farmers can strengthen themselves and allow their own innovation, how to make small improvements, add visibility and add replicability through it. So I'm quite optimistic. I think it's a beautiful area to work on, and probably one of the best opportunities that we have as a sector to illustrate the positive contribution that we have made. Intensification of agriculture was possible because of the work of many of you. I think being able to feed people, to allow decent wages, to ensure that there's economic development has come from this. I'm quite excited about the things that are coming because of what are happening in the innovation space.
Thank you for sharing that excitement with us, and I hope the industry takes that as well with them. So, pleasure having you once again, Fernando. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And for your contributions. A big round of applause for you.